So, well, thank you very much. That was like a fascinating insight into it. I know we went through that earlier today, but it's riveting. The thing that really called out to me from that was the whole notion of there not really being Māori until the whites came, and there was a need for them to be, well, the whites saw a need to classify them as something. Fascinating and so insightful. So thank you very much. So what I wanted to do, and one of the reasons why we're doing this talk this evening was, and Shorty mentioned it in the opening statement. Who's seen that video, that Momondo video? For those of you who haven't seen it, it's a bunch of people going through the experience of talking about who they are and then seeing their DNA results, much like Carla did there, and it just being transformative because it shattered the view of who they thought they were. And just to put it in context, 175 million views of that video, right? Globally. It has been one of the most viewed, most shared, most liked, most commented things on social media that's ever come into existence. Phenomenally successful. But why? Why was it successful? Sure, it's shot really well. A lot of energy and time went into making that video. The stories are just gripping. And the people are so generous with their emotions. But I think it's been popular because it struck a chord with a lot of people. I think we're coming to a point, more so in a Western cultural perspective, so where the whole notion of identity is potentially changing. Western culture permeates everywhere. We have this kind of cultural imperialism, if you like, or hegemony, or whatever you want, but it's there. Wherever you go in the world, it is, the West is the predominant cultural scene that we have. It certainly would be the case here in New Zealand, it would be the case in Australia, it's certainly the case in England, America, Canada, and which is where we're kind of seeing a lot of traction around DNA. And I think what's happening is people are getting to the point where they're going, okay, how do I get a sense of difference, right? I want to be something else other than what I am. There's a desire, I think, to be, and it's weird because it's a desire to be separate and unique and belong at the same time, and those two things seem quite odd together, right? But that's what you get, you get this ethnicity estimate, and it's an estimate, right? We have to remember that. It's science and it's evolving, and where it is at the moment is not where it will be in the future. But it gives you this snapshot of where your ancestors might have come from within the last 2,000 years, right? Because if we go further back and back and back, we all seem to come from just one place. And so it's giving you an insight into who you are. Now, how many family historians are there in the audience? Yeah, just a few of you? Yeah. This is not news for us, right? If you do family history, it's really a process of understanding who you are. Now, you don't start off with that, always. But you start off on this process of building back and finding out how you came to be, right? And really what it is a process of identity, of understanding your identity. A form of narrative therapy, if you like, but it's all ultimately about understanding who you are and how you came to be where you are, particularly for those of us in countries that are built by immigration or colonisation. And so it's not a surprise for us to go, oh, well, identity's a really cool thing. But the difference with DNA is you don't build a sense of identity record by record, right? Microfiche by microfiche, card catalogue by card catalogue, and build it up. You spit in a tube And 6 to 8 weeks later, you click on a button and suddenly you're somebody else, right? And it's just such a, I just think it's such a fascinating experience. And it's an experience that's built really on two premises. It's either an augmentation of who you are, so you find out you've got a bit of Asian in there, right? Or it's the negation of something. So let's say hypothetically you think you're Māori, right? You think you've got a chunk, and in fact you've done some family history and you're pretty sure it's there. And you spit in the tube and send it off, and you patiently wait for those results that never seem to come. And then they turn up, you get the email, you click on it, you get the results back, and it's not there. Does everything fall apart? Do you suddenly not become that? It's the absence of something in you change who you are and how you see yourself? I don't know. I don't know what that experience is like. I've watched it happen to people, and I've watched them try and fit that into the model of who they are, and it's odd. It breaks them down, but then they rebuild themselves in a different way. And whilst DNA is a wonderfully powerful tool, I mean, I'm sure those of you that have done it, you've seen the process, the transformation that can happen. Its ability to be able to connect you with cousins around the corner, or if you're like some of us, with 2,000 odd of them, from around the globe. But it's part of a story. It's part of a story of who you are. When we launched DNA, really our goal was to help people do family history. It was a family history tool, right? And it's great for that. But it's suddenly becoming something else. It's becoming this tool for understanding who we are and where we are in the world. It's becoming a tool for connecting us. But it can also becoming a tool for changing who we think we are, and then by default who we think other people are. But what I'm slightly concerned about is, because of the nature of the people that are doing DNA tests, is it is not the only thing that makes you who you are. And when I try and frame it, when I talk people through this, I talk about a genetic self. Right, DNA is great because you can get that. You get that ethnicity, that's wonderful. And if anybody's ever done a medical DNA test, you get a whole bunch of other things that tell you, how you're made up, how you're constructed, and good and bad. But there's this other part of who you are, this mimetic self, all right? And memes are those things that are passed down from, generation to generation. They're the family stories that you tell, about the convicts in your ancestry. And I know there's a lot of you there who don't think you've got them. Well, you're just not looking hard enough. It's the villains, it's the heroes, right? It's the things, these are the stories that, it's one of the things we chase in family history, right? Is the stories. But if you're not biologically connected to those stories, do they go away? Do they stop having the impact on you that they do? If you've grown up in a community that's a Māori community, and that's how you see yourself, if you get a genetic result back that says you're not that, do you stop being that? I would think not. If you find out, if you're adopted and you decide that you want to go down a path of looking for your biological parents, do you negate the work, the stories that your adopted family gave you? Or do you augment who you are by adding the genetic information to that? And for me, I think it is that. I think it's an addition to, even if the results change and challenge who you think you are, they become part of you and you absorb them into who you are. And watching people change the way they structure themselves because of their results. You can see the power that it has. And I'm so glad that we're actually having this this is the first time we've really had this discussion. And I'm glad we're having it here in a country where two very different cultures sit side by side, where notions of identity are quite complex. And just by the numbers that you put up, it's quite obvious that people feel an affiliation with something without necessarily having any kind of other connection to it than just that feeling of belonging. And so what I wanted to do was to talk to you guys and really to get your feedback on what does identity mean? What does DNA identity mean to you? How important is that in shaping who you are? Because one thing I can be absolutely certain of, it is not going to go away. It is in its infancy, right? Consumer genomics is just beginning. We are, on the cusp of what I think is a fundamental shift in what we know about who we are. And ethnicity is just the tip of that iceberg. So we have to deal with this. And we have to start having those conversations now so that we can prepare ourselves for the future and prepare our children for living in a world where they know much, much more about who they are and probably who we are than we've ever known before. So let's have that conversation. Let's throw it open to questions.
How big is your database, please?
How big is our database? The Ancestry database is sitting at well over 2 million samples. So just to give you a sense of the size of that, each sample we have 720,000 SNPs or markers. So we have 2 million times 720,000 bits of data, and in each of those there's little bits, little A's, C's, G's, T's, and it's just a mind-bogglingly huge amount of information. But we're not even looking at your entire genome. But that, you can get your entire genome sequenced now for under $1,000. That's essentially, that means you could get a clone of yourself, right? Complete clone of yourself if the science was there, right? That is something that most of you could afford to do if you wanted to do it. That's terrifying.
So what is the marginal error in such situation? So it's an estimate, the
Yes.
DNA. So
Yeah.
what's the marginal error?
Well, the margin of error, in the ethnicity estimates, the margin of error is, we give you quite a wide range. So just to use an example, that 48% that you had, that of Māori, that could be anywhere from, say, 24 to 64. But what we believe it is, based on what we know, is 48. So it could go either way. Because it's a scientific process, we absolutely include that in the results that you get. And if you drill down a little bit, you would see that there's a margin of error. When it comes to the cousin matching, we use a process called centimorgans, which determines how close you are. But the more centimorgans you have, the more closely related you are. The more closely related you are, the more confidence that we have about that relationship. So anything better than fourth cousin, we're pretty confident. Yes,
You said you've got something like 2 million samples. What's your sample size for Māori and Pacific Islanders? Because I've talked to people and I'm not sure whether to encourage them to do their tests. They're trying to find their Māori and Pacific ancestry, and I just wasn't sure if there was kind of enough other people to match with yet.
2064.
2,064 cousins.
140-something, okay?
But I mean, half of those sort of these on the pattern,
Well, we had a quick...
I had a flip through, most of them look like they're Māori to me.
Yeah, so Look, the answer is I don't know how many I don't know how many Māoris have taken the test because we don't ask how you identify. When we look at the average amount of Pacific Islander in the total number of tests that we've done as of 12 months ago, it was around the 2% mark, right? But you've got to remember that the tests in itself skews towards, New Zealand Europeans, all right? And it skews towards family historians because of the nature of the product. So there's a whole bunch of the community that until very, very recently just hasn't looked at that. I mean, we don't target the test at anybody, but because of the price point of the test, where the advertising runs, the nature of family history generally is that it does have a tendency to skew more towards New Zealand Europeans because they don't know, they're not brought up with the broad family histories that Māoris are. So there's I think a stronger desire to know and to understand amongst whites perhaps. So, but I'm wondering if that is changing. I'm wondering if the science is bringing in more people who might be a little bit more curious to understand just what they're made of. So, yes, ma'am.
Continuing on from that, what countries do most of your samples come from?
So, we're selling the product now in 36 countries. And look, the vast bulk of them come from America. What you've got to remember about America is it was built by Europeans. So there isn't anything like an American genetic makeup because they come from everywhere. So in order of, we don't break down numbers by country, but I would just, off the top of my head, I'd say it's America, probably UK and Australia are neck and neck. And in Australia, I include New Zealand in Australia, and I'm sorry about that. But, the invitation's always there in the Constitution if you guys are interested. And then I'd say there's probably Canada in there, Ireland, and then a smattering of other countries. So we're getting a lot of interest in the Nordic countries for some reason. They seem to be interested in finding their cousins in America. God knows why, but that's what they want to do. So look at it, I am amazed at the level of interest that we are getting. Certainly in New Zealand, it almost seems to be over-indexing.
I don't know, this might be going in a little bit, but because Māori people have got all their own mechanisms for knowing who they are and our relationships with each other, the DNA testing might not be seen as relevant.
I think you might be right.
But it's interesting, I'm glad I did it, but I don't think I would have bothered probably.
And we were having this conversation actually earlier today, and I think there's a reason for that. And I think there's a reason that those of us from a Western cultural background are moving towards this. And I'm going to get a little bit highfalutin just for a minute, but we're seeing an increase. We're becoming a very secular society, right? I don't think there's any doubt about that. And because of that, we're losing the great narratives that we've had, right? The sense of tradition and the sense of permanence that comes from the practice of tradition. And it's going. And it's going because, again, we are developing this homogenized Western society. There's no grand narratives for us to link into. And so we're using DNA as a way of trying to get a link back into that. And I think particularly younger people, and DNA does skew younger, they are looking for that in the same way that when we did family history, we're looking for that link back to England, back to a greater narrative story, because the countries we're in are young And we want that history. We want to connect into that history somehow. And I think younger people are using DNA to do that. And what's fascinating about it is then they're curating their sense of identity through social media in a way that we never did when we were developing our sense of identity. We didn't have that channel.
Yeah, and I would like to say from, again, the social and the psychological component of it, over the last 7 years there's been this huge impetus in Māori society to create a Māori renaissance and encourage speaking Māori, to have kapahaka and to have much more broad education around Māori history. So I think that our population has got access to that grand narrative. We've got our own television station, we've got our own language use, and we've got our own accessibility. So we're creating that but in a different kind of form. And that's why I think the numbers are going up. That's why even when there's so many mixed Māori, they're still taking that this in the box. So that is very similar. You know, we want access to our grand narrative as well. We want to have a sense of identity.
Yeah. But you have a grand narrative, and I think what I'm proposing is that we don't, and we want one. And maybe that's what we're looking for. Maybe that's what family history is about, and DNA is just an extension of that. Yeah.
How do you ensure the DNA contamination, not the risk of contamination and the identity theft? That cyber attacks on your database could be an identity theft and contamination of the DNA?
Look, it's a really important question. The contamination is, there's kind of two questions there, so I'm going to answer them as two separate questions. Contamination. So contamination is absolutely an issue when you're dealing with DNA. It's far more of an issue when you're dealing with ancient DNA, but you know, the process through which we collect the DNA, a saliva sample, it's your spit that goes into the tube, and usually it's the individual that does it, and they seal it up. And then when it gets to the lab, it is dealt with in laboratory conditions. And so the possibility of contamination is eroded away as much as possible. It's not zero, again, because this is science, and we know the reality is it's not zero, but it's as close to zero as we can get it at a point that makes it affordable, right? If we wanted to eliminate even more contamination, we could send scientists out to collect your sample, but that would be price prohibitive, right? So we're doing, you know, I think we do the best possible job that we can to avoid cross-contamination. The security thing and a whole notion of privacy is like super important. So I'm glad you asked that question. Look, this is a DNA test. This is a genetic test that you're taking. And when you do that, you're putting your information on the internet. So think about that. I mean, if you're going to go down a path and do this, just think about that's what you're doing. And you need to be comfortable with that. Now, we have a lot of checks and balances in place to make sure that that information is secure, right? And we have there's certain regulations that we have to follow around that to make sure that only you know what your DNA is, and you'll see that when you actually take the test. All we're interested in is the activation code on the test tube. We're not interested in who you are. The only thing that connects you is your account on Ancestry, and that is a secured account. So you can't, to the best of my knowledge, you can't steal somebody's identity with 720,000 markers out of a 3 billion marker DNA thing. That's not possible and wouldn't really be profitable anyway, even if you could do that, because I'm not sure what you'd do with it. But we go to great lengths to make sure that there is as much security around that as possible. But it is important to remember you are taking a genetic test and you are doing that online, all right? And you can't, I can't talk around that because that's exactly what it is. So what you can do, there's some things that you can do. You can take the test, right? And I'm pretty sure every company allows you to do this. Once you've taken the test and you've got your results, you can have your sample deleted so that your sample isn't stored. As a default, we keep your sample because as science improves, you might want to be retested. But you can have your sample deleted, and then you could delete your results and it would disappear. Yes?
What's going to happen when people who've had their DNA tested die? You know, it's such a new thing that eventually we're going to get to a point where the generations are dropping off and there's all these DNA samples out there. Are you able to donate your results to your...
Look, yeah. So, you know, the family historians in the room are probably smiling politely to themselves because it's exactly the same problem with, you know, decades of family history research, right? You have to set something up in your will to take care of all the assets you've created in your life, right? Your house, your bank account, your decades of family history research, right? And your various, spits and samples around the world. So I would absolutely do something and put something in your will to that effect. And some not Ancestry, but some organisations actually allow you to nominate a party to do that, which is a fantastic idea. It's so good we might steal it. Yeah, pay homage to, I think. Yeah. And so, look, it's really important. And I think the same thing, applies to any online asset you might have, be it Facebook, Instagram, What do you want to have happen with that? Facebook is like so important. Think about how much of your daily life is recorded, if you're like me, on Instagram or Facebook. And that's going to be a family history record for your great-grandchildren. What do you want to do with that? And just ask an archivist about the challenges of born digital content? Yeah, and that'll be a 3-hour conversation. But you need to think about those things, and DNA is just another aspect of that.
I want to ask if this company establishing the Ancestry belongs to a religious group?
No.
Or, I know it was initially Mormons?
No. Ancestry, great question. Ancestry has never, ever been part of the Mormon Church. It's never been part of any religious organisation. If they were, they wouldn't have employed me. Ancestry is owned by a venture capital company called Silver Lake. It was purchased by Silver Lake in April of this year. Prior to that, it was owned by Primera, another venture capital company. Prior to that, it was listed on the NASDAQ. Prior to that, it was owned by Spectrum Global and a number of other venture capital companies. So it's just a faceless corporation. There was a question right up the back, ma'am. Yes.
Hi, I guess this is kind of aimed at Carla in relation to Māori and identity. I get what you mean when you say that identity is a social construct, and I think to some extent perhaps that's what a lot of us are doing in terms of whakapapa and family history. I don't understand though, being New Zealand Māori and having whakapapa going back ages, why someone would want to identify as being Māori if they don't actually whakapapa Māori.
Wow, yeah. There's lots of, this is the...
Like I'm sitting here as somebody who speaks Video, has ancestral ties to 4 different parts of the country, Ngāti Porou, Ngāti Kahungunu, Kaitahu, Ngāi Takoto, rich history. So I'm really quite confused why somebody who isn't Māori, and I think it was something like over 4,000 people, would identify as that if they don't whakapapa Māori.
I can only make some guesses about that.
I'd be happy to hear.
They might be married to a Māori person, have Māori kids, everybody that's close to them is Māori, they feel much more aligned to those people than any other group. Might be one. They might also have been adopted, they might be a whānau, adopted by Māori parents and born to live into that identity, see themselves as Māori. There's lots of different reasons, but I think it would be primarily because they align and identify more closely to Māori people than any other group, and I can only hypothesise. The other thing is, I think, why not?
Yeah.
Why not? I mean, It doesn't mean other people have to accept it as Māori.
Playing devil's advocate, I get it. And Māori.
You can say you're Māori, doesn't mean that other people accept you. But if you want to, I mean, there's some great things, and I've showed you the pictures of works that the traditional metal group and, you know, kapahaka, and there's some really positive things about Māori society. I can see why it's appealing.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Totally. Like, who wouldn't want to be part of that?
It's just like, no.
You don't, do you mean that they shouldn't be allowed to? Is that
Not so much that they should be allowed to, I just don't understand why they would. When I think about all the whakapapa and stuff that we carry with us, and the stories that come with us, and taonga tukuiho, those are very real connections. In fact, whakapapa is a very real connection. If you look at it in Māori terms, you go right back to iwa matua kore. So I guess it doesn't make sense to me why somebody would think that they would say that they were Māori if they don't have that connection.
So they, okay.
It is a literal link.
Yeah, but to me that says that there's I know what you mean. You're saying that, you know, Māori have got these specific characteristics that are absolutely unique to Māori as a group, and someone who hasn't got those things wants to be counted in that group. What I'm saying is they feel close to it for some reason. But I'm only guessing. My feeling is they've probably got Māori partners in other kids. Or they're whāngai. And, you know, whāngai just means adopted into Māori families.
The other alternative is they might be culturally adrift, and they might not feel, they might be in a situation where they don't feel a connection to anything, and they want to feel a connection to something. And to feel a connection to Māori culture probably means a connection to a longer occupation of a land in which they live. It's interesting because I sit on the outside and I look at the cultural history you have and I compare it to my own, and you always want what you don't have. But I look at that and I go, yeah, why wouldn't you want that? Why wouldn't you want the richness of that? The exotic, from the outside again, nature of that. I can see where that would be appealing. It's not a decision that I would make myself, and I think you're right, we can only hypothesise about it. But
there are other ways of showing a respect for that affiliation, though, that isn't necessarily about claiming that very personal link.
I see where you're coming from.
Like tautoko Māori issues, don't be Māori if you're not.
You know, I see where you're coming from. But just on that, we don't know that the ones that identify as the ethnic group Māori, but they might kind of know that they've got whakapapa, but not know specifically what it is, so they're a little bit hesitant about
I wish they would come see us.
Yeah, it could be that, it could be the thing. But, you know, I can only guess. But I think it's quite flattering, personally, that, you know, it's so popular.
Yeah. So there was sorry.
Yeah, Brad, the DNA testing is wonderful at finding secrets that may have been long hidden in our ancestry for various reasons, and that can come as a real surprise to someone who's tested. I've looked and the impact on the person who's tested. You've said yourself, you've sort of seen a variety. In some cases, that can be quite a severe shock, require all sorts of ongoing counselling, whatever, in some extreme cases. I've had a look at all the three major DNA providers, and only one of them is at all explicit in terms of identifying the risks of DNA testing in terms of some of those sorts of surprises. Do you think enough is being done on that front? Are the companies being responsible enough in terms of identifying not just the wonderful benefits, but also the risks and helping deal with them?
I think the short answer is no. I know we do explain what the risks are in the terms and conditions. Who's read the terms and conditions, right? I know I have, because I kind of have to, but I don't think we do. And this is one of the reasons why we're having this conversation. I don't think any of the people playing in the space, with the exception of those that deal predominantly with parental issues, really expected it to be anywhere near as rapidly adopted as it's become. And so we're kind of trying to go, okay, how do we catch up here? What do we do? How do we take people through this process? Now, I sat down with Carla and I took her through her results and I explained the context of them and what they might have meant. And we had a little bit of a look at your family history, so we were able to put it into some context. You can't do that with 2 million people. And the challenge, and you can't do that with a product. And so we need to think about how do we do that. You can give people a whole heap of information up front, but they're going to want to spit in the tube and get the result before they do anything. And I know you and I were having a conversation just before we started, and you brought up a really interesting point, and I think I want to make that sort of my closing. Do we need to wrap, or have we got a bit of time?
You've got until 8.
Oh, well, no.
8.
And I think I want to ask you something as an audience. Who owns your DNA? Right? Now, Ancestry would argue it does, but it doesn't argue that. But when you take a DNA test, right, as I've done, as Carla's done, you get back a result that tells you something about who you are. But it also tells you something about who your parents are. And it might tell you something about who your other parents are and not who you think your parents are. And so suddenly, and you might think that's awesome, and your parents might think that is absolutely terrible. So let's do some catastrophizing here, because I love to do that. You take a DNA test, right? I've taken a DNA test. My DNA is out there amongst the 2 million other samples. And I get a match, and I get a close family match. And it's a half-sibling, right? And let's just say it's, I reach out to them. They don't know I exist. I didn't know they exist. We discover that my father, who's since passed away, had a child with somebody prior to meeting my mother. My mother knows nothing about that. My brothers know nothing about that. The family knows nothing about that. In fact, my dad was very discreet. And he may not have known anything about that himself. Right? Just by spitting in a tube, I have this potential to impact so many lives with that one piece of information I've got. What do I do with that? All right? So your original question was really what's the company's duty of care around priming you for this? What's your duty of care with that piece of information? What should we do with our DNA?
For adopted children or switched at birth, do you offer any possibility to identify their biological parents?
We don't directly offer that, but that is absolutely what the product is used for. By an increasingly large number of people who are in that situation. But it's not what we designed it for, but it's absolutely what it does. But I think the question for us is,
where would you start if you find out you've been adopted or switched at birth? Where would you start to find your biological parents?
Look, we could have a whole other evening's conversation on this, but the first thing you do is you take a DNA test and you take as many as possible and you put it in every possible database, and eventually you'll get a match. The question is, that match might be tomorrow or it might be in 20 years. What we're dealing with is contemporary information.
Yes.
What we're dealing with is stuff that can have a direct impact on people who are alive today. Not to say that historical records don't, but we're not talking about you finding out that somebody was illegitimate 100 years ago.
I'm talking about the signing of those records today and there's still an ethical dilemma about that.
Yeah.
And I think you don't tell the people you're going to impact because they're already...
What do we do? If say you're a sperm donor, right? Say that's something you decided to do, and you've potentially got, hundreds of children out there, but you absolutely didn't want to be contacted, and you were doing a wonderful thing, right? by going through that process. You were really having a positive impact on all these people's lives. And then suddenly, right, you're getting all these people, right, who could potentially be your child coming to you. That's not what you got into this for. And it circumvents other systems and processes that were put in place to keep these things hidden. These people had a right to privacy that DNA is kind of stripping away. And when we do these things, we have to, when you go into the process, you have to go into it knowing that that is a possible outcome, right? It could be, look, just looking at the number of people in the room, right? At least one of us is going to get a DNA result that will probably differ from the one we were expecting to have and might cause us to question either who our parents were or who our grandparents were. And I've done enough of these to know that on a numbers basis that's probably would happen with somebody in this room. Now who it is, I don't know, some of you might already know that it's you. Yeah.
And on the other side, as far as I'm concerned, it has proved that all my family history today is incorrect.
Yeah, and it can absolutely do that. And I've had almost exactly the same experience, so there is still something I can't explain. The evening is coming to an end. I want to thank you all so much for your participation. Thank you, Carla, so much for setting the scene for us and giving us some wonderful insight into what identity really is. And thank you so much to Auckland City Libraries. I'm a huge supporter of libraries. They are a wonderful, wonderful cultural resource. And we need to come here and do as much as we can, because if we don't, they'll disappear, and I can guarantee you they'd never come back. So do whatever you can to support your libraries. Yeah, I'm sorry, we do need to wrap it up. You can grab me afterwards if you want to have a conversation. But thank you very much, everybody.